Good evening. I'm George Calderaro, Director of Outreach Programs at Columbia University School of Professional Studies. Welcome to My Story, Paved with Good Intentions, a conversation between former Iran hostage Barry Rosen and Dr. Margaret Jo Shepard. This conversation is part of a series of epic SPS talks given in the community primarily by Emeritus Columbia professors. The series, sponsored by Emeritus professors in Columbia, Columbia's School of Professional Studies, and Morningside Gardens Health and Retirement Services, began in 2017. All of you with us from home or another safe place comprise our largest audience to date, numbering over 200 online attendees. Because of the audience size, this is a webinar, not a Zoom meeting where you would be able to see each other. So you won't be able to see anyone but the participants. Before I introduce our speakers, a few housekeeping items. We are recording this talk and will be posted on this event's page on the SPS School of Professional Studies website next week. During the talk, please feel free to post questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Following the talk, our speakers will respond to your questions, which I will read. To participate in the Q&A, again, use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, not the chat button. You all should have received biographical information about tonight's speakers with your confirmation, but I will try to be brief in introducing them and not being too repetitive. Barry Rosen's first view of Iran began in 1967 when he left Brooklyn for a 2-year stint as a Peace Corps volunteer. He taught English and he learned Farsi. In many ways, Iran became a second home for Rosen. A decade later, he returned to Iran as the embassy's press attaché, and that home became his prison. On November 4th, 1979, he became one of 52 Americans held under brutal conditions for 444 days by militants and Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Khomeini. He was threatened with automatic weapons pointed to his head, a victim of mock executions, held blindfolded for days on end, tied hand and foot, and thrown into Evin, Iran's notorious prison that until today holds innocent Iranian human rights activists, as well as writers, artists, and expatriates. Although the crisis ended on January 20th, 1981, Rosen and his colleagues have spent nearly 4 decades fighting the agreement that gave the hostage-taking regime in Tehran immunity from any lawsuit by the long-suffering men and women of the U.S. Embassy. On his return to the United States, Rosen took up the position of assistant to the president of Brooklyn College and convened a major conference on Iran, which led to the publication of the book, Iran Since the Revolution. Shortly after 9/11, Mr. Rosen persuaded Teachers College, Columbia University, where he was director of public affairs, to resume its work of the 1970s in Afghanistan by rewriting elementary school textbooks for the Ministry of Education. In Afghanistan, he led a group of Afghan and American educators in writing the curriculum and all primary school textbooks, while introducing a style of teaching and learning new to Afghan teachers and students, encouraging student participation. His year-long posting lasted more than 3 years. Mr. Rosen has 2 graduate degrees, one from Syracuse University's Maxwell School of Public Affairs. The other is from Columbia's Department of Middle East Languages and Cultures. Mr. Rosen has written for a wide array of newspapers, appeared on network and cable television, and authored a number of op-eds on U.S.-Iran relations. During the talk, we will be joined by Barbara Bogutsky Rosen, Mr. Rosen's wife, with whom he co-authored The Destined Hour, about their experience during the hostage crisis. During the crisis, Ms. Rosen was a member of the Family Liaison Action Group, which attempted to work with the Carter administration and others to free Barry and his fellow hostages. In her efforts, she met with and lobbied world leaders, including French President Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, German Chancellor Helmut Schmidt, and Pope John Paul II. After her experiences, she has strong feelings about the media and how the press handled the hostage crisis. She and Barry Rosen have 2 children and 5 grandchildren. Leading tonight's conversation is Dr. Margaret Jo Shepard, Professor Emeritus of Education, Teachers College at Columbia, where she established the college's Learning Disability Program. In 1967, Dr. Shepard created degree-granting programs to train teachers and educational specialists to work with learning disabled students. She taught at Teachers College for nearly 30 years. During the same time, Dr. Shepard created a diagnostic and tutoring center at Teachers College, originally known as the Child Study Center, today as part of the Center for Educational and Psychological Services. It provides a practicum site for teachers and psychologists, as well as services for children and families. Dr. Shepard was chair of the 1988 group that created a professional development school for teachers in New York City's Community School District 3. She was a member of the Urban Network to Improve Teacher Education and Japan United States Teacher Education Consortium. From 1980 through 1993, she helped train teachers in Ontario, Canada at the University of Waterloo. For 25 years, Dr. Shepard has been a consultant to the Office of Special Education and Rehabilitative Services, U.S. Department of Education, and to the New York City Board of Education. She has served on many national educational advisory boards, as well as editorial boards of professional education journals. Following her retirement, the Margaret Jo Shepard Scholarship Fund was established in her honor for her guiding premise that special education can improve the cognitive status of disabled children. Dr. Shepard was the permanent professional educator and teacher educator on Barry's team in Afghanistan and was Mr. Rosen's closest confidant on the teacher college team in Afghanistan. So with that, Professor Shepard.
Thank you, George. Barry and I are going to begin our conversation by thinking and talking a little bit about his Peace Corps experience. And we've had several conversations about that. But about 10 days ago, I received an email from him that began with the bold black letters, "I didn't want to leave." Reading the message that he sent under those words, I thought I would ask him to read that message to you tonight as we begin our conversation. So, Barry, if you'll read to us what you told me about your feelings about Iran based on your Peace Corps experience, it will give, I think, a good start to this conversation.
Thank you, Joe, and thank you everybody for being here tonight. I truly appreciate it. I wrote this note to Joe because I really felt that Iran was my second home, and it was hard to leave it. I didn't want to leave Iran when my Peace Corps service was over in the summer of 1969. I was very happy there with my life at the police academy, where I was teaching English to the cadets. They were bright young men who were eager to please and amazingly respectful and wanted to know everything about me. I learned a lot about Iran and Iranian culture from them, and I hope they learned something positive about me and America. As a going away present, the general in charge presented me with a wonderful carpet that I still have, and the students gave me a collection of the poems of Rumi, the great Iranian mystical poet. I knew I would miss Iranian food, not just the kebabs, but the luscious khareshts or stews that are perfection. There's nothing like Iranian bread, freshly made and wrapped in newspapers. There's also nothing like making your way through an Iranian bazaar that runs for miles while donkeys carrying massive loads nearly trample you. As a souvenir, I worked with a jeweler to fashion a ring that had Darius the Great's soldiers chiseled in the ancient city of Persepolis marching around my ring. I had plenty of time to explore Iran because there was always a holiday commemorating one of the Shia saints. I loved to travel all over to discover evidence of the ancient history of Iran, in which it seemed many Iranians took for granted. I visited much of Iran, but Isfahan, a city planned with marvelous Iranian architecture architecture and called by its inhabitants as half the world, always struck me as a favorite. I enjoyed hidden gems like the tomb of the great Mongol Old Jaitu, who converted from Buddhism to Christianity and finally became a Muslim. This 14th century conqueror is enshrined in one of the greatest turquoise dome tombs in Iran, with nothing but desert-like conditions where once stood the capital of Iran. I shared a railroad stateroom of sorts with, which seemed to me at the time anachronistic, with a chador-covered woman and her son on their way to visit the shrine in the holy city of Mashhad. I even had exciting trips to Afghanistan, where one could check into a building that was called a hotel, but really serviced you with hashish. I made my way to Lahore, Pakistan, to meet a cleric who was one of the early pioneers dreaming of an Islamic state. I took a bus back from Pakistan to southwestern Iran, and once we arrived at the border, I kissed the ground. I was home again. I was amazed at the variety of ethnicities that made up Iran, but knew that the Persian language and Shia Islam were the keys to the Iranian psyche. I needed to go home to see my mother, especially my father, who wasn't well. I cashed in my beautiful Queen Mary boat ride for 2 airplane tickets for the Iranian girl I thought I was going to marry. In fact, I introduced her to my parents, who instantly liked her. But the issue of her being a Muslim and I being Jewish got both families very upset and eventually killed the relationship. But what I seemed to miss most as I was leaving Iran was the Iranian form of etiquette, much more elaborate than ours. It's called tarof. Its rules evolved in order to give people one met the dignity they deserved, which was done by showing one knew one's place in relation to another. Its purpose was to enhance self-respect of everyone involved. Its code of behavior and social customs helped guide people through society. And finally, I truly missed the friends and families that I was very close to in Iran. But today I'm in fact in contact with them through Facebook. Thank you.
Thank you, Barry. We're going to fast forward now from 1969, when Barry, as he has told you, left Iran, and to 10 years after that, when and I'm going to give you a very brief statement about the important things that happened in his life between 1969 and 1978. First of all, Barry taught middle school students biology in a public school. He and Barbara married and had 2 children, Alexander and Ariana. He earned, as you've been told, a degree in Middle Eastern languages, studies and languages at Columbia University. And he became the chief of the Uzbek desk for Voice of America. His office and temporary home were located in Washington, D.C. Sometime in 1998, I'm not sure exactly the date, Barry, but sometime Barry got a cable. And I'd like you to tell us who that cable came from and what its purpose was.
Oh, the date actually was in 1977, late 77, where the former head of the Soviet desk at the Voice of America, who was my chief, Jack Schellenberger, had requested that I join him in Tehran to serve as the Press Attaché, because they needed someone who knew something about Iran that seemed to be not present at that time. Somebody who was willing to go out in the streets, talk to the people in the press, and also to be able to speak to them about what was going to happen during the revolution or the revolutionary period in Iran. So I joined the embassy in November of 1978, right in the middle of all the disturbances and martial law that was being executed by the Shah and his general, President Azhari.
So you had planned, I think, and Barbara can correct me if I'm wrong about this, to take your family with you to Iran. At the time, Iran was one of our biggest embassies on the planet, I think, and it was an embassy to which people did bring their families. But you learned before you left that US citizens were leaving Iran in droves because of the upheaval and unrest that you just talked about. So you went back to Iran by yourself.
Right. It was always an off again, on again situation from the State Department during that period. I was supposed to leave even earlier than November, but no one was really sure when the time was right. At the time, earlier on, I thought we would go together as a family, but as things got worse and worse during the revolutionary period, we were told not to bring our family. I had differences with father-in-law for a long time concerning whether I should take my wife and children and his grandchildren to Iran, given the situation. But I think the situation dictated that I go alone and the family stay. We always talked about the possibility that if things quieted down, they might join me, but it never happened, of course.
Now, how long had you actually been there before the first attack on the US Embassy occurred?
I was there in November of 1978, and the first attack took place on February 14, 1979, 2 days after the revolution ended and Ayatollah Khomeini's forces were able to take control of Iran. That day, or the 2 days before, on February 12th, when it occurred, the revolution actually settled down after a great firefight between the Imperial Guards and Iranian dissidents and students and guerrilla fighters. The coast seemed to be clear for us to return to the embassy on February 14th, 1979, but that did not really happen the way we thought it would.
Barry, this is important, I think, because I don't believe most of us, citizens of the United States, realize that there were actually 2 attacks on the US Embassy. 2 attacks, not just one.
Mm-hmm.
Would you tell us more about the first attack on the embassy, which, as you said, occurred on February 14, 1979?
Right. You know what was interesting is that February 12th, when there was an amazing upheaval of military force going on downtown and even uptown in Tehran, we stayed at home and just waited for days. And then on February 14th, Ambassador Sullivan, who's pictured here on November 14th, after the attempted destruction of the embassy, ordered us to come back and start our business again. So on that morning, Jack Schellenberger and I, who was the political affairs office, or he and I drove downtown to public affairs office. I meant drove downtown to the embassy, and I was told to go upstairs to see the ambassador, Ambassador Sullivan. I had learned a few minutes earlier that Joe Alex Morris, who was a great reporter for the LA Times, was killed on February 12th during the firefight between the Imperial Guards and the opposition. So I walked into the ambassador's office, and I was talking to him about what to do about Joe Alex Morris's body. The attempt was to get his body out of the morgue and then send it to his family in the United States. So as we were talking, rocket-propelled grenades flew across his windows and landed against the walls, and it dug away through the entire wall. I dropped down, he dropped underneath his desk, and his office looked like Swiss cheese. It was riddled with bullets all over the place. He next ordered me to leave the room, and I thought he was a very brave human being, and he had a long experience in the Navy, so he knew what to do. And he used his walkie-talkie to talk to the Marines and to others. But he ordered me to go into the safe room where our cable traffic was stored, and along with several others, the CIA station chief and several others. And we started to shred documents, knowing that the forces that were trying to invade the embassy, who we later found out were the Fedayeen Echad, a guerrilla force, was involved in trying to take over the embassy and, I believe, execute us all. Before we knew it, they were over the embassy walls themselves at that time and moving throughout the chancery. And they moved upstairs to the second floor while they were shooting at us. The Marines held their fire, and then the ambassador told me to surrender the embassy.
Can you tell me what that means? What do you do when you surrender an embassy?
It was very simple. I mean, they threatened us that if we didn't leave, they would be killing others who were already taken. And we had to finish shredding. And at the same time, I looked to the station chief, who happened to be Jewish too. And I said, what's a nice Jewish boy like you doing in a place like this? That was my little piece of humor while we were thinking that we were going to die any moment. So I just said, we surrender. We just put your guns down and let us leave. So that we opened up the safe door, which was steel, and then we were let out. I was grabbed and I was told to open up the safes that were all through the embassy. They wanted to find out our names, what we did, and what was going on there, and if there were any pieces of information that they could pick up. Unfortunately, I said, I don't have the combinations to any of the safes because my building, which was down Takhta Jamshid, south of the main street, was already destroyed, and I didn't know anything about what was going on in the embassy at that point. I was then, after they roughed me up, they brought me down with several others, station chief and several other members of the Foreign Service, and we were thrown against the wall, our arms up, and it seemed to me that the next step was just to execute us. But as in John Wayne movies, somehow the hero comes in, and the hero was Ibrahim Yazdi, the foreign minister of Khomeini's provisional government, with troops that were firing against the Fedai Nahal. Within a few minutes, our executioners were diverted and they started to disband. The whole day then was spent trying to avoid getting killed from bullets and RPGs that were being used from across the street from the main street itself, Takht Jamshid. We spent that entire day trying to move people around so that we wouldn't get shot. And that took place from 10 in the morning till about 4 in the afternoon, when in fact I said to Jack Schellenberger, let's exit the embassy. I think we'll be safer outside. And we caught a cab, an Iranian taxi. We sat in the back near 2 women in chadors, and they had opened their newspaper, and in the newspaper they read, the American embassy has fallen. So I kind of smirked a little bit, and we just drove home.
I'd like for the audience to remember that this is the attack that we don't know much about.
Yes.
Right?
What had happened was that on the same day, the American ambassador to Kabul, Afghanistan, was shot and assassinated. That took over our news, which was over the U.S. Radio networks about in the morning. And then by the time the ambassador's assassination took place, that took over the major news for the day.
Now, I'd like to put just a little more context here. The Shah had left Iran, right? He was out. He had gone into self-imposed exile. And he left in January before this happened. And,
right, January 16th.
Yeah, and Khomeini had just come back from 15 years of exile, right?
Yes.
And so Khomeini was in Iran organizing his new government, and the Shah was gone and homeless, actually, and needing medical attention and care, but probably not expecting ever to return to Iran again.
I think that he knew it was up. I mean, the notion of his illness really wasn't very open at that time. And basically he was a nomad. He moved from, he didn't go to the United States immediately because the State Department at that time was somewhat, apprehensive about him going directly to the United States. And this has a lot to do with the experience in 1953 and the overthrow of Mohammad Mossadegh, which we'll talk about.
Yeah.
But he traveled from Egypt to Morocco and then other places before landing up in the United States later in the year. But I had seen Khomeini's entrance to Iran, and I had never been more absolutely blown away by what was happening that day in February 1. That was 13 days before the attempted takeover of the embassy. People were absolutely enthralled with Khomeini, and the audiences were varied, but mostly working class people, I think, in the streets. And you could see the love, or at least the admiration for what they thought was the savior of Iran. And in point of fact, sometimes he was described as the Gandhi of Iran. Of course, mistakenly, Ayatollah Khomeini had a knack of saying the right things to all audiences without really telling the absolute truth. In point of fact, he always talked about there would be free and open elections, when the new government would be formed, women would vote, there would be direct participation for the new parliament, the Majlis. So to a large degree, he appealed to a large swath of Iranians, intelligentsia, working class people, middle class, rural people, but we could discuss that later too. So he had a tremendous amount of following. I've never seen anybody so acclaimed in my entire life.
Let's go back to what was going to happen to you. All right,
Okay.
the embassy was closed, right? Or it had been given over to the provisional government. And you and the Americans were taken back to Washington, D.C., right?
Right. What was happening at that time was that we were, after the attempt on the embassy, there was a slow change going on. That is, several embassy foreign service officers would leave on certain days, and I was one of the last to go with Jack and several others, and then the ambassador left. We were sent back to the United States and then asked to go to Washington to talk about what was the future of the US Embassy in Iran. The Iranian desk officer was there and others. There was a long discussion, and at least I know that I said that I think we shouldn't go back, and that we should just lock the door, lock the gates, and wait until they ask us to return. But I think the impulse was that Iran still needed the United States, at least from the point of defending or helping Iran defend against the Soviet threat, which was always in part of American foreign policy vis-a-vis Iran, which in the long run always was a disservice to the United States of America and a disservice to Iran. We never got out of that syndrome of always thinking that the Soviets would be there and that we needed to defend against the Soviets. And therefore we were always involved in Iranian affairs.
So that was the argument for maintaining the embassy, right?
Absolutely.
It needed
absolutely.
to protect the Iranians from the Soviets.
And I see secondarily also, let's not forget American business, and that's oil. Oil was the important resource that Iran had. And in point of fact, years previous to that, the Shah of Iran was building his great civilization, as he called it, on the backs of high oil prices that caused inflation in the United States, inflation in Iran, then a recession. So oil was an important feature too.
Okay, now, Barry, you were given all of you, not just you, were given the option of not, I'm sorry, I'm gonna step back from what I was trying to say. The idea was that the embassy would stay open.
Right.
That it would be reopened and it would stay open. But you were given the option of whether or not you wanted to go back, right?
Right.
And about half of the people who were in the situation to have this option decided not to go back, and about half of you decided to return. So how long were you out of the country before you came back to reopen the embassy?
Well, first let me say that the design for return was a simple one, in the sense that there would only be about 50 people in the embassy, Remember, we had a 26-acre embassy, so 50 people could easily go around anywhere in the embassy. But the idea was not to have many people and not to keep any cable traffic in Iran anymore. We were given the option to go or to leave. I took the option to go back. Maybe it was foolish and it wasn't really good for my family. And Barbara and I had really long discussions, but I felt I wanted to go back. So by the time we returned, it was late March, yeah.
All right, and then came the second attack, right? On November 4th, 1979. So how long were you were back 4 or 5 months before the students' attack, or a little longer than that?
A little longer.
Yeah.
I would say that it seemed to a large degree that we were never able, even in our return, even though I met with newspaper writers and editors, we were always handicapped in the sense that we had contacts in the provisional government. Bazargan, who was the prime minister, or Yazdi, the foreign minister, and others, or Minachi, who was the head of the area that dealt with press and other affairs, would meet us, but never really getting into the inner circle of Khomeini's inner circle. We had known Ayatollah Beheshti and Talagani, who were really very sharp individuals who were, I think, people who we could deal with, but not really Khomeini himself or those really, really close to him. The other aspect of what was going on is that there were always demonstrations against the U.S. Embassy. One demonstration would take place on an anniversary of some date or another. I would also visit newspaper offices that were being ransacked while I was practically there. It just seemed as if we were living in a world of revolution all the time. I was stopped and asked by what they were called people from committees. These were basically revolutionary committees of people, and sometimes thugs and sometimes others, who would control a piece of territory of Tehran. And so you had to move from one area to another area of Tehran and constantly go through the situation of being interrogated for a moment and then let go. What I thought was telling, that we were an impotent embassy, to be perfectly honest. By the time we were settled in February, we had a committee controlling the security of the embassy. We didn't have Iranian National Guards guarding us, but in fact, this group of committee members run by a ex-butcher, but now revolutionary. So in point of fact, he would steal property, control the entrance and exit of the embassy. We were prisoners in our own embassy. You also have to understand that by the time we came back, we were waiting for a new chargé or ambassador. We didn't receive a chargé immediately, but then chargé Langan came. And we were hoping that we would be able to change the situation, but it was always impossible, very, very difficult.
Now, you expected to be attacked again, isn't that right? Yeah, or you weren't surprised by the fact that you considered that a possibility, because, correct me if I'm wrong about this, but I think I remember reading that you said to someone in Washington that if they were going to let the Shah into the country to have medical care, to please notify you 2 days in advance so you could run to the airport.
Yes, but see what happened is this. The Shah of Iran was finally given the okay to go to the United States for medical care. He had contracted lymphoma for several years, but it was hidden from the Iranian people. But now it became very, very bad. And point of fact, I think that he was not going to live very long from the diagnosis, at least. The Iranian provisional government under Mehdi Barzargan guaranteed the United States government that there would be no issue concerning the U.S. embassy, that Americans would not be hurt, and that that they were going to protect the embassy if indeed anything happened. So what was interesting and almost fateful was by the time the Shah was about to leave for the United States, the Comité was replaced by the Provisional Government Guards. And they had no stake in our safety whatsoever. I think that if we had the Comité with us, I think that we would have been able to possibly survive the takeover. So what happened, I think, what sparked the militant students on November 4th, 1979, the students following the line of the Imam to take over the embassy, was the meeting, I think, not very politically correct meeting between Brzezinski, who's National Security Advisor, and Mehdi Bazargan in Algiers for the anniversary of the Algerian Republic. According to the people who were the students following the line of the Imam, this seemed like this was an intriguing situation where there seemed to be a collaboration between Bazargan and Brzezinski in some strange manner. You have to understand in many ways, there's been a history of Iranians blowing up many, many situations into some sort of conspiracy theory. Usually in Iranian history, there's a conspiracy theory from truth of either England and Russia, or United Kingdom and Russia, controlling Iran, and everything is done deviously. For many months before the Shah left, the Shah even told Ambassador Sullivan that, I think the CIA is out to get me, to remove me from Iran. So, to go back to the students following the line of the Imam, once that meeting took place, most likely on November 1 in Algiers, the plan was set to take over the embassy on November 4th. And November 4th was the anniversary of an invasion of Tehran University by the Shah's military in 78. So when the marches started to protest against us at about, must have been 9 in the morning, it started to rain. We had assumed that this was nothing extraordinary. And in point of fact, a lot of the media reading of Iranian press seemed not to indicate that there was anything unusual, except that the students following the line of the Imam actually knew where to go and what to do, because there was a route that they would be taking, and known in newspapers.
You're talking about after they got into the embassy?
No, that's before. So
Okay.
they immediately, before we even turned around, we saw this protesting group, and it was maybe in the hundreds or more than that. They started to jump the fence, and the order not to shoot was given by Ambassador or Langen, or Chargé Langen, when he was in the ministry, the Foreign Affairs Ministry that day. And so he was talking to us over the phone. So the Marines who really wanted to be able to defend the embassy were told never to shoot. In point of fact, I was told by one of the hostage takers years later, Abbas Abdi, that if indeed any of the students were shot, there might have been murder committed by the students. As they climbed over the walls, my office happened to be, you see where that blue arrow is? That blue arrow is my office. I had been lived in another office.
You're talking about over here, right?
Right. When I was earlier in Iran, I was in an office downtown, but that was destroyed. So then I moved into the embassy grounds, and that was the former motor pool. So I was only a few yards away from many of the students. They barged in. I told my people, please, many of these were Armenian and Iranians who had lived in Iran for years, of course, and worked for the United States Embassy. And they were very, very frightened. Once they barged in, they had, some people had some weapons and some people had clubs. And I was ordered to get up and answer some questions about who I was and what I did. I stupidly said to them that this is the United States Embassy, and according to the Geneva Accords, you're not permitted to invade an American embassy. Well, that was great and all that, but it meant nothing. And they then threw me down on my chair and tied me up. And before I left, I said goodbye to my staff, and the women were crying, and I was crying, and everybody else was. And I said to the students following the line, just leave these people alone. They have nothing to do with us. And that was the last I saw of them. And then I was brought into another office for a while, and then transferred into the ambassador's residence, the kitchen of the ambassador, and tied up, and I had to lie down on the floor of the kitchen. But I then had the opportunity. I was very busy doing nothing, and I just said, I want to see what's in the drawers of the kitchen, and I saw a bottle of scotch. I took a shot of it, and then two interrogators with a woman, and not Mary at that time, who was very famous. She became very famous in Iran. She was one of the English speakers, and had her education in the United States, but that was not her. And there was some heavy interrogation going on, and I just couldn't take the abuse. And so in Persian, I said, do you would like to have a drink of my scotch? And then that was it. I got a couple of slugs in the face, and that was it. And then I landed on the floor, and that they didn't bother with me.
Yeah.
For the entire afternoon.
We won't spend any time on this if I'm wrong, but I think at one point you told me that when this second attack occurred, that you and some of the other staff at first expected that you would just be let go, that it was typical in situations like this when people got in trouble in a foreign embassy, that they were asked to leave and leave immediately, and that was the end of it. And you imagined that that might happen to you, right? Did I understand that correctly?
Yeah, I had thought that, you know, given the situation, that maybe Ayatollah Khomeini would tell or order the students, who were very independent. Believe me, they were independent of the government and only would take orders from Khomeini, I believe, that he would say to them, let these people go and give them 48 hours to leave the country. I had never thought that that we would be spending 444 days in captivity. I never thought it would be more than even a couple of days before the provisional government would be able to straighten things out. But in point of fact, the provisional government was a paper tiger. Mehdi Bazargan was dispensed with by Khomeini. And as I was lying down in that kitchen, I heard a radio broadcast from Khomeini, who indeed supported the takeover of the US Embassy and what the students following the line of the Imam did. He had said that we were the Lane Jasusan, the nest of spies, and that he would support the students in finding out what the United States was up to in undermining the revolution. In point of fact, the taking over of the US Embassy was very important for the Iranian Revolution. It solidified the Khomeini as the leader. It totally solidified him as the leader of the revolution by short-circuiting the United States in this situation. Khomeini could indeed find out who the United States was contacting during this period, and most of our contacts were people who came to the embassy, but might be people that Khomeini and his likes would not want to be around. And so, in many ways, the students sealed the revolution for Khomeini.
And they hadn't asked his permission in advance, and he didn't even know for sure that it was happening until it did, right? You've said this, I'm just repeating it, that they were totally independent from him in the planning and execution of the takeover of the embassy.
From what I know and from what I can gather, there are talk that there are some mullahs who were leading it, but in the long run, they were really independent. Many of them were students studying in schools of technology, were not in what I think are considered the elite schools of Iran. And they were in many ways sons and possibly daughters of people from aspiring sons and daughters of people who were Bazari families. And so they were came from more of a traditional background. But they were aspiring, and this was a great opportunity for them possibly to take some time off from what they were doing.
Now, Barry, let's go back. You're the one who taught me this. You have said that if you really want to understand what was happening in Iran in the 1970s and around the time that you've been talking about, you need to go back in the history, at least to the first revolution that occurred right at the turn of the 20th century, right?
Right.
So will you tell us a little about that? And
mm-hmm.
then
the coup.
The coup is so important. So let's hear about the first Iranian Revolution and then the 1953 coup that the CIA was responsible for.
Iran actually was the first Middle Eastern country to have a constitution that between the years of 1905 and 1909, and then it moved on a little further. And again, in the latter part of the century, in 1979, Iran had another revolution, and then there were two different constitutions. The first constitution was a constitution against the Qajar dynasty that ruled Iran from 1795 to 1925. And some of the same forces occurred in both revolutions. Foreign forces, in fact, in Iran in the early 1900s, the British would in fact, or some would have a concession on tobacco. Some others would have a concession on all the natural resources in Iran. And then in 1907, a man by the name of Darcy gets the concession from the Mozaffar-ad-Din Shah, the Shah, for oil exploration. And that concession went on for about, who knows, about 30 some odd years. And then at the same time, you had a Qajar dynasty that was corrupt, authoritarian. And then you had the opposition, which was made up of many different forces, but if you want to be simple about it, you had more liberal intelligentsia and moderates and traditional ulama or clergy in Iran. Point of fact, the clergy and the liberals and moderates were able to force Mozaffar-ad-Din Shah to first accept the fact of a house of justice and then move on to the notion of a national assembly or a parliament. What eventually happens is that the Constitution is written, but it is written in a more liberal fashion based on the Belgian Constitution. But it had given the leading mullahs in Iran the option to veto laws that were against Islamic law. That part of the Constitution never really got instituted. Then in 1979, you have the same situation when we can talk about that. But I want to just mention one thing. There are many Americans who had very good relations with Iranians during that early period in 1900s. There were missionaries who, of course, wanted to convert Iranians, who never did convert. But in point of fact, they taught Iranians English, sometimes science, sometimes other subjects. But they were admired in many ways for what they were doing to enhance the education of Iranians. And then, of course, there are one very important person that's sometimes neglected is a man by the name of Howard Baskerville, who's a Princeton graduate who went over to Iran in 1907. And he was a teacher, and he got involved with his students who, in point of fact, many of them were in the constitutional revolution of 1905 and 1907. In 1907, he, with Sattar Khan, the leader of the revolutionaries in Tabriz, fought off tribes and Mozaffar ad-Din Shah's troops, and point of fact, he was sent out to try to open up the military option for the constitutionalists, and then he was killed. Now, even today, under this regime, there's a bust of Howard Baskerville in Tabriz, and it was dedicated in 2003. So, you know, there is some legacy there of some very good people who tried to help Iranians. So that revolution really didn't really get off the ground for a long time. There was, besides the Civil War, there was World War I, where Iran was occupied by Britain, the Ottomans, and Russia. And before you turn around, in the early 1920s, a man on horseback comes to save the day for Iran, supposedly. And his name was Reza Khan. And there he is. That's after he becomes the Shah of Iran and displaces the Qajar dynasty and brings in the Pahlavi dynasty.
You're speaking about this man.
And with the nice heavy mustache, very tall for an Iranian at that time, and even taller for an Iranian now, and for an American. And to his, I would say, right, is his son, Mohammad Reza, who becomes king in...
You're talking about this man now.
Yeah, 1941. He's on the same train with his father. And there's Reza Shah with Ataturk, where he visited Ataturk. In fact, Reza Shah tried to copy himself after Ataturk because he wanted to have a modern state for Iran. He centralized the government, totally authoritarian as most Shahs were. But in point of fact, he built railroads with the assistance of the Germans, who saw themselves as the outsider in many ways between Russia and England, and tried to get themselves on the good side of the Shah. So Iranian telephones were produced by Siemens. Many other things were done by the Germans. But point of fact, Reza Shah made Iran into a nation state as of today. Iran was replete with tribes, Qashqai, Bakhtiari, Lors, everybody, all over the place. And for a long time in Iranian history, the capital of Iran was the only place where the government really had any control. But he actually opened up Iran and in many ways destroyed what I would call the tribal forces in Iran.
And he was the father of the last Shah.
Right.
Shah.
And what was very important for him was to diminish the power of the clerics or the clergy in Iran. And he intimidated them in many ways. And there's a story to illustrate that fact that that Reza Shah had gone to Qom, the holy city of Qom, where there developed the seminary at Fayzieh, the very important center for Iranian learning, as well as there are centers in Najaf, very important. And he went to Qom and with his wife, and she wore very I would see-through kind of chador covering. One of the ulama or clergy was very upset and told her that to be ashamed, she should be ashamed of herself. So he took his walking stick, the Shah, and beat the living daylights out of the cleric. And that's how he seemed to assume, his relationship with the ulama in Iran.
Let's move to the 1953 coup.
In 1941, as the Allies were fighting the Nazis, the British and Russians battled with Reza Shah's army, and it was a quick victory for the Allies. The Allies mainly needed to or wanted to use Iran as a transport center to Soviet Central Asia for tanks, jeeps, planes, to assist the Russians who were at that time in 41 on the defensive, but trying to move towards the offensive. And so the United States was involved, obviously, because we had about 20,000 troops doing transport and other things that were going on. And so we were in Iran, not so much to do anything politically involved with Iran, but in point of fact, what eventually happened is that President Roosevelt had some interests in talking to some of the members of the staff of somehow getting involved in Iran after the war so that possibly we can assist Iran to become a democratic country, in his words. Of course, we remained from 41 all the way up. From 41 to 1953, the United States and Iran had pretty good relations in terms of an attempt to build an Iranian economy in some ways. And that also was the freest time that Iran had ever had. I think from 41 to 53, the Iranian Majlis, or parliament, met, and Iranians were feeling the notion of democratic institutions. In point of fact, the United States was somewhat instrumental in assisting Iran in removing Soviet troops from Azerbaijan, northwestern Iran, and Kurdistan, where the Russians stayed too long. They stayed beyond the end of the war, and they wanted to have wanted to assist Soviet republics set up by members of the local Communist Party. But in point of fact, the Iranians did most of the heavy lifting. The United States was in the UN trying to assist. In 19, I'll just move very quickly on to what's going on. Mohammad Mossadegh is a very important man in many ways in Iranian history and Iranian American history too. He was a very interesting person. He came from a very important Qajar family. He was an aristocrat. He spent time in Europe getting his doctorate in Switzerland. Came back and worked in the Qajar dynasty, but then as Reza Shah was going to take over as Shah of Iran, as a younger man, Mossadegh was only one of two people, I believe, in the Majlis at that time who voted against the idea of having.
Excuse me a second. Deanna, can we get the pictures of Mossadegh?
Yeah, they're on there. I see it. And so later on, Mossadegh becomes a member of parliament in the 40s after Reza Shah leaves. And eventually, after he said to the Shah, originally he became prime minister, look, the only way that you're going to stay as king, you'll have to give up your role as head of the military. And this has always been a sore point with the Shah of Iran. The Constitution of 1905 said the Shah of Iran does not have the power over the military, but he wanted to maintain that as his role because he was very limited at that time. The Shah said no, and he went to someone else, but through the machinations of the public and other members of the Majlis, Mossadegh came to power again. And one of the things that Mossadegh is important for, he was the great nationalist in the Middle East. He was the first Middle Easterner to nationalize their own national resources. His aim was not to have any British control over the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. They had been taking a tremendous profit from oil, giving Iran a very small amount every year. There were constant attempts, even under Reza Shah, to try to change the arrangements, but the British would never accede to it. There are a lot of reasons for it. One is selfishness. I mean, Winston Churchill was in power in the 50s, and we'll talk about that, but he and others never wanted to give up the natural resource of oil, because oil, in the beginning, in 1900s, the British Navy turned from coal to oil because of Iranian oil. And okay, there were jobs given to Iranians, but menial. Iranians lived badly in Abadan, where the oil area was, in southwestern Iran. And so what eventually occurred is that he was supported in many ways by President Truman. He became Man of the Year in Time magazine, 1952. And Truman believed in a nationalism. He believed in destroying the notion of colonialism. America was new to the area of foreign policy after World War II. And to a large degree, many people from the Truman administration tried to convince Mossadegh to compromise with the British. British used gunboat diplomacy. They took all their people out of Abadan. The Iranians really didn't have many technicians at that time to run oil. But no matter what, Mossadegh was uncompromising. He visited the United States, he went to the UN, he defended Iran, and he was always applauded because of that. Then administrations change. In 1953, we're talking about 52, 53, the Eisenhower administration comes in, and the fear of communism is so enormous during that period, during the Eisenhower administration. Remember, McCarthy was doing his job internally, and John Foster Dulles and his brother, who was head of the CIA, and Kim Roosevelt, I believe, nephew of Teddy Roosevelt, was the head of the CIA operation. Point of fact, it's very, very, very complicated. Khomeini really had a gigantic following. I mean, not Khomeini, and Mossadegh had a gigantic following, but he had problems with the National Front faction that he actually started, who were liberals, and he had some support from Ayatollah Khashoggi, who then deserted him. But in point of fact, the royalists and others and members and Ayatollah Khashoggi were able to execute a coup. The first coup took place, attempted coup took place on August 16th, where General Nasseri, on behalf of the Shah, told Mossadegh that he was no longer prime minister. And then Mossadegh's troops kiboshed that. But then on August 19th, the second attempt was made with Kermit Roosevelt paying people and thugs marching through the street, and the Iranian military under an Iranian general who then becomes the prime minister. They overthrow Khomeini. Mossadegh was almost killed, and he then escaped, but then was captured, and then went to jail for 3 years, and then he was in house arrest from 1953 to 1967. He died on March of 1967, and I arrived in Iran in May of 1967.
So you didn't get to meet?
But no one would ever even, people would talk. I would be able to find out information about him because he was just an amazing individual who people would talk about, but would not really in public not talk about. But what was amazing about it, he really believed in secular nationalism. He believed in the idea of a constitutional democracy. And I think that was one of the freest times in Iranian history. Now, I would just say this, that though Khomeini used Mossadegh's name left and right during the Islamic Revolution, I know that those two individuals would never have gotten along. He would have been, that is, Khomeini would have taken and put Mossadegh in jail again if he had lived, because he was anathema for Khomeini. Khomeini did not really want a democracy, a liberal democracy. He eventually wanted an Islamic republic. But that changed how we were perceived by Iranians until the 1979 revolution. We were always considered the country that had the honorable presence, but then defected and acted just like the British or the Russians vis-a-vis Iran. Okay.
That sort of leaves one speechless.
This is a poster that I was able to collect, and I have in the book that we did on Iran. What is it? What do we have? What is the title? Yeah, Iran since the revolution. In the back of the book, I was able to collect pictures of the posters, revolutionary posters of Khomeini. There's Khomeini, and what we are seeing is Khomeini at the demonstration in the place called Jaleh Square in Tehran on September 8th, 1978, wherein more than hundreds of people, maybe sometimes even, we don't know, in the thousands, maybe perhaps 1,500, were shot and killed by the Iranian military. And that's on September 8th, 1978. This was in downtown Tehran. Now, we have to look back into 1977 and 75 and to say that the revolution really started almost by the start of 77, but there was a precursor to all of this. The economic situation in Iran had been devastating. Just like in the Constitutional Revolution, the inflation, there was inflation in the Constitutional Revolution in 1905, but there was an inflation, a gigantic inflation in Iran in 75, 74, 75, 76, and then a recession, because the Shah was always upping the oil prices worldwide. That's why the United States had terrible situation in inflation and oil problems. Prices were astronomical. And the Shah's excuse for this was he was constantly modernizing his government, and he wanted to spend money on the military. He saw himself as the guardian of the Middle East and the Gulf. And in point of fact, Kissinger and Nixon dubbed him as our man in the Middle East during the Vietnam War. That was the Shah's area of control. In fact, Iran, according to statistics, had the 5th largest military in the world, doubled his army, bought amazing amount of weapons, costly weapons from the United States, and aircraft, the finest. Then he bought tanks from England. In fact, before the regime was about to fall, he was in the midst of trying to buy AWACS from President Carter, and everybody, all those years. Look, we said oil prices are high, but at least maybe we can sustain ourselves by keep selling arms to Iran. What happened by then, when you had Jimmy Carter coming to Iran? Before Jimmy Carter came to Iran, he became president in 76. He had a human rights policy, which the Shah was very, very attuned to, realizing that Iran was considered by many in the international world, Amnesty International and others, as a violator of human rights. The Shah of Iran tried to change the situation to a certain degree, provide court systems that were not military, so that people would be able to have their own lawyers, not military lawyers, nor that things would not be open to the public. He at least said he would open. But the Shah himself was supported by the military, supported by his own secret police, Savak. I'm not clear exactly how much influence we had over Savak in terms of intelligence or anything else.
Oh, there's a possibility that we helped him create it, right?
Yes, we did help create from an intelligence point of view. I don't know if we needed to teach him how to torture people, but though we learned ourselves how to do it in Iraq, but I don't know indeed if we at all were involved in the torture situations in Iran. But what you did have in 77, where I think President Jimmy Carter was absolutely deaf to, was the early movement of the secular nationalists themselves, the old members of the National Front from Mossadegh's period, who were trying to build up opposition to the Shah at opening up the system. One thing the Shah never understood is that he would never accept the fact that the system could open up and give the opportunity for people and political parties and other institutions to have a say in society. And then the secular nationalists started, I think, the revolution in many ways through pamphlets, writing, meetings that were interrupted by Iranian troops. And then then you see this picture here with President Carter on December 1977, New Year's Eve, calling Iran an island of stability in one of the world's more troubled areas. Well, I think the Carter administration, as well as others, should be castigated for what happened. There was just no understanding of what was going on in the revolution or what was coming. The intelligence was poor, and the Carter administration was at least 80%, I think, in my opinion, behind the Shah and never knowing that he
unpopular he was.
Unpopular or not, they knew how unpopular he was, but the notion of the Soviet Union always came in. He will be our man, and we will protect him. We need him as much as he needs us.
Barry.
So, but the real situation occurs on about 8 days, 7-8 days later, when the Shah orders an article written in one of the major newspapers in Iran, Etela'at, where it stated, he didn't write it, but others wrote it for him, that Ayatollah Khomeini was part of this red and black institution that was out to destroy Iran, red by being communist, which is always good to use, and black meaning the ulama or the clergy. And he also defamed Khomeini, calling him an Indian who was involved with Great Britain. For whatever reason, that struck a chord in the students in Rome, the holy city of Rome, and there were demonstrations against the Shah. There were students who were shot, these were theology students, shot near the seminary in Fayzieh in Rome, and that started what is called Chele, the 40 days of mourning. After the first 40 days, there'd be another demonstration, and then there would be shooting and killing in other places.
Okay, now I want to be sure I understand what you're talking about. You're talking about events that were occurring around the time that you guys were taken hostage, right?
Right, no, this is before. This is before the revolution actually takes place. But the revolution eventually takes place, as I said, on February 12th. But what happened all through the time, through 78, the Shah is vacillating and then attempting to use force. Vacillating, attempting to use force. At the same time, Khomeini is getting more and more control over the revolution. And his messages through cassettes and everywhere, he started to have a greater influence over the revolution than the secular nationalists. The secular nationalists didn't really have any influence in the revolution because the Shah destroyed them beforehand. So look from the bazaar, the local bazaar, to the rural Muslims living ulama or the clerics had connections, a network. The mujtahids or ayatollahs in Qom were following Khomeini. Even the moderate ayatollahs like Shariat Madari, who believed in, to a certain degree, that the Shah should have power, was turning against him. And so the revolution eventually occurs when Khomeini cannot really, when Khomeini says, I will not abide by the Shah, but his tune was, I will provide a liberal government to Iran. So he suckered in many people in Iran.
We're running out of time.
Okay. Yeah, it's late.
And so
I can't believe it's 4:09. Oh, yeah,
let's get back to the hostage situation,
okay,
or the remaining time we have. Okay, all right.
Okay, let's do it.
Let me say that it is important and interesting to know that the history of our relationship with Iran has been open at some times, right?
Yeah.
That's an overly simple way to say it, but you're right that if we learn about the history of Iran, we'll see that it hasn't always been, that we haven't always had as troubled a relationship with it as we have right now.
Right. Yeah.
In talking about the hostage, let's think for just a minute together how we can say a couple of significant things about the hostage situation that people can take away from this meeting with them.
You know, I think I was talking about the notion of taruf, but there was no.
Can you speak a little louder?
Yeah, remember we talked about the notion of taruf, and
yeah,
well, there was no taruf in the students' relationship to us. They had treated us very badly on the whole. Some of my colleagues, I think maybe John Limbert might be here, Ambassador Limbert, watching, and he was in solitary. Many of us were living in darkness from many times. We were moved out of the embassy after the attempted rescue on April 24th and 25th. We were then dispersed all over the country, tied hand and foot, and then again back to Tehran, and we landed up in Evin prison for 6 months in a situation that was terrifying. Iranian oppositionists were being tortured downstairs while we were upstairs in the cell block. And there just never seemed to be an end to the constancy of fear. I developed my own form of depression, fear of getting killed. I just don't know if it was, of course, real in many ways in my mind, but I just didn't know what was happening to me psychologically. There were moments when guns were put to my head several times, and I was told to sign a document that I was a traitor. And it took the 10 seconds that they gave me to answer was very, very troubling for me, because I was afraid of how would I be received by Americans. We were given the opportunity to say hello to our family. So this picture on television, this picture in 1980 was one in which broadcast from the embassy, where I said hello to my parents and also wished them a happy Hanukkah. I didn't particularly think, I mean, the question could be asked whether it was stupid or not, but I just wanted them to know that I cared about them. And in point of fact, the Iranians never used that against me. Yeah.
You have said something more than once that other people might be interested in. You, as the students were unspeakably cruel. You know, there's no way of justifying or explaining or sort of giving them the benefit of the doubt. They were consistently cruel to you in awful ways. But you said that you have said that you thought they were fighting a psychological warfare with you, that I assume was more playing with your brain than sticking nails or pins in you or something like that.
They were trying to intimidate us so that we would be servile and listen to their orders. It seemed in many ways that they had seen so many James Bond films in the years before the takeover that they checked the heels of our shoes, wanted to make sure that we didn't have any listening devices. All that was going on. At the same time, they were trying to intimidate us and also propagandize that about America's inhumanity in Vietnam and our and that there were some demonstrations in the United States in Miami in which they said, oh, African Americans were rioting against America. You see what's happening to your country. Well, maybe they could use that propaganda today. Yeah. But in point of fact, they were attempting to intimidate us. But also there was this weird situation where some of the guards who were not very ideological, who needed to be there for certain reasons, maybe they were getting points somewhere, and somehow, they would talk to me, and I tell them, look, I have a family, I want to go back to my family. And they said, you know, look, when this is all over, could I get a visa to come to the United States? Well, that was absolutely amazing to listen to, but I suppose in their thought process, you could do both.
Right. But you have also said that as cruel as they were, you also thought that they were frightened by you.
Absolutely. They were frightened because we were the big bad Americans. We were the nest of spies. In point of fact, they actually took all our cable traffic and scotch taped it together and actually published about 20 volumes of all our cable traffic. And nothing of it at all was detrimental to Iran at all. But they tried to use anything they could to indict us. In point of fact, they accused me of being a spy and plotter, P-L-O-T-T-E-R. And I said, no, not a spy and plotter, a spy and plotter, P-L-O-D-D-E-R. But they didn't get that. You know, so I mean, they were trying at every end to intimidate us and also intimidate the United States government. But President Carter, to his credit at least, said that if anything happened to the hostages, there would be force against the Iranian regime.
Joe, if I could just say something. When Barry's talking about how the hostages were being treated and how you just said that they didn't seem to know which way they were going. Sometimes they might be sort of, you know, intimidated by them. At other times, they wanted to control them. A lot of that was going on with what we were seeing here in the United States. One day they're going to free them. The next day they're trying them. The next day they're executing them. And it just went on and on and on. It was described as being on a roller coaster. That we here in the United States had no idea how this was going to end, when it was going to end, and what was going to happen. And it was because of all of these conflicting signals that were being sent from Iran to the United States, and I think with the people who were holding you at the same time.
Well, you know, Barbara had played an important role back home, so perhaps you can talk about.
Yeah. Well, are you willing to talk about that for a few minutes?
Just for a few minutes.
I'd love to get questions in, so we'll see what happens.
I begin, I think, by talking about the organization flag. Just explain that.
Okay, FLAG was the family organization, and the families organized because the agenda of the State Department and what we're doing as a government is different from what the family agenda is going to be. And that's just obvious. Our agenda is to humanize, make the hostages into real people, show them that they have families, show the world. Because just talking about, you know, the 52 hostages doesn't mean anything. It doesn't have any meaning to people. But by humanizing and showing who we were and pictures of them with their children and different families around the country were all doing it. So that's what FLAG was there for, and to keep the hostages as individuals and the fact that we wanted them home. They weren't pawns to be used and sacrificed.
Oh, you know what? You know what's interesting? That picture of Barbara with Jimmy Carter and Cyrus Vance shows Barbara gave President Carter the photographs of both of our children, Alexander and Ariana. And
with the request that he keep that in mind, that their father was being held in Iran. And there are these two beautiful little children who may never get to see him again. And I think that was important. And I think that no matter how we feel about how Carter handled the situation with Iran politically, on a human basis, he was there, he felt it, he knew what our suffering was.
I could second that. I think that it took a lot of courage by President Carter to visit us after we were free in Wiesbaden. And he was in a room with all of us. And he received a lot of, I thought, a lot of flack against him. And he took it like a man. And he always said his priority was our life, and I think he was true to that in many ways. Barbara and I have differences over that.
He was to a degree. He was until just before the rescue mission, when the welfare of the hostages and the position of the United States, the honor of the United States, was all of a sudden reversed, and it was the welfare of the United States and the well-being of the hostages. And that was a red flag for me.
Now, you say that occurred at the time of the rescue operation? Before or after it?
No, just before. There was a definite change in the rhetoric, which to me, it was like a bell went off and I said, uh-oh, something is changing here. Because now the well-being of the hostages was not number one for the government. That's why I said when there's an agenda, the government's agenda is different. And I think that looking at the situation from a political point of view, there were other factors that had to be considered, not the factors of the family.
Well, possibly the election was looming, and
yeah, my feeling is that it was planned in April. If Carter had gotten the hostages out, he definitely would have been reelected because he would have been a hero. If in the attempt to get the hostages out, some of them died, all of them died, it would have been over before November, and the attempt had been made. What happened was the most horrific thing that possibly could have happened. The 8 servicemen who were killed, it broke our hearts. It truly broke our hearts to see the carnage in the desert in Iran. It was horrible, and the way they were treated was so disrespectful.
You know, that was the thing that always bothered me. You know, I've always had this notion the Iranians had a great self-respect.
Barry, a little louder.
I always had this notion of Iranian great self-respect for others. Ayatollah Khalkhali was called a hanging judge. Was so horrible during that situation that it really, after the fact, I learned all of that. I was so upset about it. In point of fact, what we did when we came, I learned about the attempted rescue only 3 months later, as I was rummaging through the garbage in the prison, and I got a newspaper and was able to read about it. But when we came home, all of the hostages decided that we were going to help the sons and daughters of all the 8 men who perished, the 8 servicemen who perished, and provide them with college educations. And we did do that. I went to schools. Everybody went to local schools and spoke before so many students and faculty and fundraising, and we were able to get the public actually to help us.
And also the people who were on Operation Eagle Claw have lived because of the failure of the operation. They truly believe they would have gotten the hostages out. I don't know. But they've always felt that it was their fault that it didn't work. And they've lived with a lot of guilt over this. And it wasn't. I mean, they were truly heroes. I always said that. The hostages, you know, were treated as heroes, but they were victims. They were taken. They didn't know this was going to happen. These men went in with the full knowledge that if something went wrong, this would be the result. And I admire them tremendously for their sacrifice.
You know, we were supposed to go to the anniversary meeting, and usually we do that, or try to go there, and go to Arlington to pay our respects, but we couldn't do it this year because of the COVID. Uh-huh. Maybe we can just talk about the homecoming fast, and then maybe we could just open it up, try to open it up. Okay, this is a picture that I've gotten from the Evin prison. This is of course, the night before, January 20th. That's me on the left or right, whatever, getting on the airplane to leave Tehran airport. And that, it's interesting, again, that was another thing that I thought was so ridiculously stupid and demeaning. We were all tied up and blindfolded on a bus. They took us from a place we didn't know where we were.
This is when you were
leaving
Iran. And
after the agreement that was made, the Algiers Accord. And as we left the bus to go on to the Air Algiers flight, a gauntlet of these students spit at us as we walked up the staircase. You know, enough was enough.
Whenever I look at that picture, it's like such a haunted look on Barry's face.
There's something so strange about that. Yeah. And it's such a violation of the etiquette.
It's code. My notion about that is whenever there's chaos or something happens in Iranian society, Tarof goes out the window and it's a free-for-all. For example, a very small example. If you're waiting for a bus in Iran, there's no Tarof. You get on that bus as fast as you can and you knock everybody down. But at home or whatever it is, you have to live by those rules. And the revolution was a situation where the rules went out the window. But I'll tell you then, I was so absolutely dazed getting on that airplane. I didn't know where I was, and in point of fact, whether I really was free or not. And the other picture is welcome back to freedom. We were in Wiesbaden getting off the airplanes, getting off the C something or other airplanes, given these coats by the military, keep us warm. That was great. They were wonderful. The military was really wonderful in Wiesbaden. I had my first milkshake. That's me meeting President Carter at Wiesbaden. You could see I lost a few pounds, about 40 pounds. So I weighed like maybe 110. And there we are.
The New York ticker tape parade, which was absolutely amazing. New York, the entire country came out with such support. Such love. It was absolutely unbelievable and greatly appreciated.
Right.
Barbara, tell what happened at St. Patrick's Church when you
when we were flying.
First of all, I need context. Where were you coming from? You were coming from someplace.
Washington, D.C. We had already met with President Reagan, and there were services. There was a parade through Washington, D.C., and there was a White House reception. And then we left D.C. and we flew up to New York on the shuttle, the old shuttle. Mm. The captain on the plane knew who Barry was and that he was on the plane, and he flew us right around the Empire State Building. Like, we did this really great maneuver. We saw it out the window, and it was like, oh my God, we're home, you know? And we landed at LaGuardia. I think there was a car waiting for it. Must have been a car, because we didn't take a cab, I know that. And we asked to go to St. Patrick's because they were having a memorial, not a memorial service, but a remembrance. It
was pretty much an ecumenical
service for the hostages for the release. And we came in. I don't think they were expecting us, but as soon as they saw us there, they brought us right down to the front of the church. They had the service, and then Cardinal Cook asked Barry to come up onto the altar. And the entire St. Patrick's Cathedral stood up and applauded in a church after Mass. Never in my life had I ever seen anything like that. It was so touching. And then we went to see the people on the construction workers on Madison Avenue, who had put up signs every day on how many days the hostages were held, and we thanked them. And then you went over to Temple Emmanuel.
Yeah.
And gave thanks there. And this on the left is Barry and me in the parade. Our family was in the car behind us, and that's my son Alexander, who's waving. He practiced his wave. Yes. And he said to me not long after that, he goes, "Mommy, do you think I'll ever get to do this again?" I said, "I hope not."
But
he's now 40. He's now 41.
That's an interesting observation for a child. Like,
I mean,
it has to be.
Well, you know, he went through so much. My daughter, not as much, because she was only 6 weeks old when he first left. And so she was 2 when he came back. So there was no memory. But Alexander was already 2, had been very close to Barry. And during the whole crisis, at one time when Barry was on television, my mother called to him, so we lived with my parents, and she said, "Zan, come look at Daddy on TV." And he turned around and he looked her straight in the eye, and he goes like this. I thought they went to Daddy, turned around and continued playing with his toys. Mm-hmm. In his mind, I think he did something that was to save himself the pain. Not that he knew what he was doing, but if somebody is gone, dead, whatever, you don't have to worry about them anymore. Mm-hmm. As opposed to the rest of us who were living with this nightmare that never, ever ended, day after day after day, of not knowing, not having any control over what was going to happen.
All right.
So I think, but he's home.
Yes.
The kids are grown. We have grandchildren. And
but I have to say one thing. For me, and for many of my colleagues, if you really want to talk about the issue of PTSD that affects our military in many ways, it certainly had an impact on many of us who went through a lot and have been going through a lot. It's not very easy when you're terrorized for over a year and more than a year to actually come out of it, oh, it's just nothing. It does have an impact on your life. And there are moments and times where I have gone through several situations and have been helped and assisted by Barbara, friends, and therapists to really help. And it has been a journey, but I feel that it's been an important journey to learn a lot about myself.
But it's also, there's a scar. There's, it's the whole family was wounded. The whole family was affected by, by this. And, in some ways still are.
Well, I should imagine that feeling constantly that you were powerless to keep from being killed.
Absolutely. I mean,
to be just, it's, I don't know how anybody ever recovers from that experience over a long period of time.
I don't think you actually recover. You can do well, but that's there within you. That's part of your DNA now. And you are, stamped with that. And, but I feel to a large degree that we've been working on that for 40 years. And it's really great to have a family that really cares and loves you. And we've stuck together and we've been a good family. We're very lucky. How about some questions after I've exhausted the hell out of most of them.
Okay.
Okay.
The first.
We can go on. We can go. I mean, we can move. Maybe we can move on. Okay. I just had the attempt in 1988 to meet with one of the former hostages. It was a great experience. We really tried to do something about what was our differences, but the regime itself made it almost impossible for us to move out of the syndrome that we've had over the last 40 years.
On
So
both,
you're talking about
both sides.
on both sides.
On both sides.
And in point of fact, I think we're at the worst possible moment now in Iran-American relations ever since 1979. This has been the worst under this current administration. Okay, I think I could respond to anything after that if they want to.
Oh, is it too late to have questions?
No,
I think we can go through them pretty quickly. There are several that I can combine. The first is not a question, but I think it's shared by all of our large audience. No question, just to commend a fantastic firsthand account and immense geopolitical knowledge Mr. Rosen is bringing to the discussion. Vast historical and cultural knowledge, so gripping to listen to you. So thank you on behalf of all of us, Barry. The next question was, President Carter was criticized during and after the hostage crisis for being too soft, weak in his dealings with the Iranian government. Do you think he should have come on stronger and threatened massive military action, leading to a declaration of war and the overthrow of the Iranian government if the hostages were not released by a certain timeline?
Well, I would say that we have differences on that, but I would say that, look, I think that that's playing poker with the Iranians, and I don't know if they were willing to play that game. Mm-hmm. I obviously did not want to spend 14 and a half months in captivity, but we did come out alive. And so I can't answer that question more than yes. I would have loved to have been rescued, and I would have loved to have
But when you
been
when
able
you were
to,
being held up, but when you were being held, and I remember you saying this, that they used to they were chanting.
Barbara, a little louder.
Lean in, Barbara.
That the people outside the embassy were chanting Magba America.
That's
that we would hear it on television, but he was hearing it firsthand. But when the Iran-Iraq war started, you said that the chants changed, but you also heard the bombing.
yes,
And you were hoping at that point that they were going to bomb, even if you didn't survive. So,
Yeah.
I think there was,
at that time, that was already very long into the situation.
It was like 6 months.
Yeah, that was in September of 1979.
So it's even longer.
When the Iraqis had attacked Iran, the Iran-Iraq war. And I was hoping that that was the US Air Force bombing Tehran. We were in prison at that time. It wasn't, it happened to be the Iraqis, but and you know, that was one of these things where you feel, oh my God, maybe they'll save us, maybe they'll get us out of this craziness. We were living in another world, absolutely crazy world. And one day we were up, one day we were down.
But in terms of President Carter, my feeling being here and seeing everything that was happening was that he put too much value on the hostages, and everybody knew it. So therefore he lost the bargaining chip. And that was just from seeing it from here. Also, the press put so much attention, and every report, and this would bother me really to such a degree. What was our press, what was American press doing outside the embassy when our diplomats are being held prisoner inside the embassy and they're walking around outside interviewing the people who are holding them? How dare they?
Well,
so you have all these
I would only support the American press. They have a right to know what's going on. I would oppose this current and what they're doing.
Because you were giving them the publicity that they wanted at the time.
Oh, well.
And the crowds would start acting up the minute those cameras went on, and the chanting would start. And it was a game. It became, to some degree, just a game.
I think Emeritus professors in Columbia has a policy of not advertising people's books. We're not Barnes and Noble. We're not a Barnes and Noble book talk. Mm-hmm. But I think you should mention your book.
Oh yeah, the book.
It's a very old book.
It's a very old book, but the book it was published by Doubleday. It's called The Destined Hour. I don't know if anybody can see it, but you can get it on Amazon, maybe $4, $5,
50 cents.
50 cents. But I think we did it. I think we worked very hard on talking about Iran.
And we worked with a wonderful writer,
our friend
George Pfeiffer, who was able to capture. I never wanted to be part of that part of the story. I thought that Barry's story, because of his love of Iran, and then going back and being there for the coronation of the Shah, and then Khomeini coming back in, he like bookended his regime, and just his love of Iran was what I had wanted him to talk about. And George was just so able to capture it, and it was, you really feel like you're returning to Iran in the opening chapters. So anyway.
I'm not sure if this is covered in the book, but there's a question perhaps from a colleague and fellow hostage, John Lindbergh, to Barry. Yes. He's good to hear you. Could you speak about our 40-year effort to seek compensation for those events?
I will. The Algiers Accords was signed, which led to the release of the hostages. In the Algiers Accords, there was, I don't know, most of it is about how much money the banks, businesses, everybody else was going to get. And then there's like a sentence that says, and the hostages are released, and they are not allowed to sue, they or their families are not allowed to sue Iran for damages. Families were never asked about this, if this was, to be signed, but it was signed by our government. Not even by our government, it was signed by Warren Christopher, not by the president. It was not a treaty ratified by the Congress. It was an accord, and it was signed under duress. We've maintained all these years that that should be thrown out, and that we should have the right to sue Iran. We tried going all the way up to the Supreme Court. They threw it out and said, no, there's this Algiers Accords, which says also, by the way, that the United States is not supposed to interfere in internal Iranian affairs, which has been done so many times I can't even count about it. However, the courts maintain that that one provision, that one sentence that says that we are not allowed to sue is of utmost importance, and so we have been prevented from suing.
We have
a number of years ago. How many years ago now?
Since 1997, 98.
Well, no, but when did we get the award from Congress?
Oh, in 2015, through the work of a tremendous law firm, Langford and Reed, and many politicians in the House and the Senate who are really on
Our champions.
our champions and who worked hard, passed a law that was in the omnibus bill in 2015, which gave us compensation and gave the spouses compensation and the children of spouses compensation. However, we were then put in part of a gigantic fund that was run by the master, what is it called? The Grand Master.
But
The Grand Master.
It's part of the Victims of Terrorism Fund.
Act, yeah, and so.
Which includes anybody who has gotten any kind of award through the courts, and they've gotten huge awards. All of the people, and I feel I really do feel terrible. I'm a New Yorker for what happened on 9/11, but all the people, not the people who died at 9/11, but extended families, which we weren't allowed to have any extended family. Not even parents could be part of our agreement. It was so constrained and limited to simply the spouse, if there was a spouse, and children, if there were children.
And the compensation that we received from Congress was minuscule in comparison to the amounts that these relatives have somehow won in the court, accusing Iran of every terrorist act in the world, which had
including 9/11.
9/11, in which they had nothing to do with it. So we have been fighting with the Grand Master over this whole thing for 5 years.
40 years, and 40 years later, there still hasn't been
resolved.
Been resolved yet. So
it's been very frustrating. And of course, it would be great to have the support of the American people, but I know the American people have other issues that go on in their lives. And especially right now, we're living under a very difficult time.
Mm-hmm. Another question, were any of your embassy staff non-European Americans? Americans of non-European descent or other people who were hostages? If so, was the treatment they received from the students different from yours, and how?
Oh, yes, well, there were originally 66 hostages.
they were Americans.
They were all Americans.
Yeah.
The ones that were freed early on were African Americans and women, except for 2 women, Kate Coup and Ann Swift. One was a political officer, one was the director of Iran American Society, and then we had Charlie who was the communicator. He was African American, and he gave him such a hard time that he stayed with us, and that was a great patriotic thing that he did, because he could have gone home, but he wouldn't. He really cared about who we were as a group.
You know, one of the contradictions that I was thinking about, and maybe this is
Charlie Jones. Okay.
maybe this is, I'm distorting something, but it strikes me as really odd that you were being threatened with death continuously. And when the one person among you who got really sick, that person was sent home for medical care.
Yes.
Oh yeah, because they knew that if anything happened, if any of the hostages died, this was going to go to a different level. That's why so much of it was bluffing. you know, they were playing their cards, we were playing our cards, but I think that there was a level that those in Iran, the Ayatollah and the students, knew that if anything happened to the hostages while they were under their watch, there would be hell to pay. I think that was the one line, that was the line in the sand.
You know, absolutely. I mean, they were afraid that someone would die in their control.
Yeah.
And
then what?
And then what? Right? Because President Carter actually did.
I mean, that was the one thing that he did say.
He did say that
I believe that, you know, he
would have done something militarily.
It didn't keep them from threatening you constantly.
Oh, not at all. Not at all. That was part of their game. Their game was always to intimidate us. That was it.
But to intimidate you, to intimidate the great Satan, the United States. So there was that's how they did it.
Well, I don't know.
And we saw it. That's why I would get so angry, because we was watching this night after night on television. Ted Koppel, Nightline.
That's right. It was created around this.
Yes,
yeah,
yes.
and it just, you know, it was like, stop it. Stop saying what they say they're going to do.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's the American journalism.
Another question, you addressed this a bit, but I'd like to hear your opinion about the Shah of Iran and the way he governed Iran during his reign. Was he in an impossible no-win situation, or did he make major mistakes that caused his downfall?
Well, he made the revolution. He was the cause. He cut off every opportunity to keep himself in power, possibly as a constitutional monarch or whatever. He could have opened up society earlier. He could have provided some opportunity for pressure groups, political parties. It didn't have to turn out to be a religious revolution. He destroyed what I would call the secular middle class and that opposition. And, you know, he needed to have that openness in society to somewhat have that ability to hear what was going on in society, and society to hear what he was doing and to critique it. He had an inability to understand that, and he started to believe his own propaganda that he was the king of kings, the light of the Aryans. He was the Farmanda, the leader. He actually tried to, for the first time in Iranian history, to control in the entire society all at once. Never in Iran was there a king or an authority that controlled everything in every society. Parties, religion, the shopkeepers, the bureaucrats, everybody. And so, yes, it's his fault, absolutely. And that's exactly what I said to his sister, his twin sister, when we were invited to her apartment right after we came home. I wasn't invited back, but I certainly felt that she should know, and she was part of the problem too. She was.
But I think some ways when you're king, you lose touch with
that type of king. He needed
any kind of king.
He needed to understand. He needed to understand that he needed to turn to a constitutional monarchy earlier on. Under Mossadegh, the Pahlavi dynasty would still be around today. His son would be king of Iran, but a constitutional monarch. It just doesn't happen these days.
Sharing power.
He had to share power, and he just didn't know how.
Another question, you touched on this a little bit, but where do you see the future of the U.S.-Iran relationship? You noted that it's at a low point, but what is there a future at the moment?
Well, there is. I mean, I don't know exactly how it will turn out, but where the Trump administration is using maximum pressure in terms of sanctions against Iran. Iran is fighting back in its own way, resisting. The sanctions against Iran are so powerful that the Iranian economy is in terrible shape, but they've been able to somehow innovate within their economy. But I do think that the Trump administration attempting to limit the Iranian nuclear policy by pulling out of the nuclear policy might in fact have the opposite impact of making or incentivizing Iran into developing a nuclear weapon. And then all things are off.
Well, there's always hope.
Yes, there's hope, but I mean, the
You
Biden,
just hope that it's in your lifetime.
I think the Biden administration may try to, if there is one, open up the nuclear agreement again, but I don't know if the Iranians will agree to that. After
But you know, one of the problems, every time we try to have any conversation, Iran brings up Mossadegh and the overthrow of Mossadegh and the reinstitution of Reza Pahlavi as the Shah. We never bring up the takeover of the embassy. And I think that that is such a deep wound that it needs to be addressed. I've never heard Iran apologize for taking over the embassy. And that was such a sin.
I think that's an important issue, and one in which even President Obama never mentioned in the nuclear agreement when they did that. I think that's the red button for Americans. Americans are very angry about that, those who were living at that time.
At least to say, at least the apology.
I think it was a tremendous, for many people, an embarrassment that really sticks to the American craw. I think that as the Iranians talk about Mossadegh, I do think we should talk about the Iran hostage situation, and we don't. We really don't mention that.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that's the last question. There were a couple of other questions about, how you handled the depression and the emotion during the experience and following it. But I think you've addressed it, and Barbara has as well, unless you'd like to add anything. There's one person, another friend of yours, I think, I'll see it's Harvey Hornstein, listening to the BBC in preparation for tonight. I heard your mom say how thin you looked. Coming from Brooklyn, the words strike home, causing me to wonder how you believe the experience affected some of your life's most ordinary behaviors, thoughts, feelings, relationships. And again, you touched on this, but I don't know if you care to elaborate to Harvey.
Do you remember who Harvey Hornstein is?
Yes, of course. I think a friend of mine, John Stickney, who lives in my building, has his hands up. Is that there? Or is he gone?
I'm not seeing him on my screen. I don't have all the.
Oh, he's at John. He's. I think. Okay. Okay. Now he's not.
Barry, I didn't have a question. I have nothing but admiration for you and Barbara.
Thank you very much, John.
Supported yourself tonight, and what I really love about you two is that you can share your disagreements across history with this webinar. That shows us a couple in love. And with that, I bid you good night, neighbors.
Thank you, John.
Thank you, John.
So happy. Whoa.
Great. I don't know, we had a whole part of this talk about your work in Afghanistan with Joe. That might be maybe another talk we give, since this one went so well.
Yes, I think that one will be much shorter, but it will be good. It will be within 1 hour completely with questions.
I think that would be great. Joe, do you want to have any closing comments?
Yes, I wanted to say something about Barry. And it has to do with Afghanistan. I think that one of the many remarkable things about you and your family, and you and Barbara together, is that you maintain a deep sense of the value of service. And that was a motivating factor in getting Barry to lead the education team that went to Afghanistan to help the Afghans recreate their state schools. And I think Barry, that you believe not only that service to others is a route to social justice, but you also believe that there are positive psychological benefits to the person who provides the service. Am I right about that?
I think you are. You're very right on that one. I think it's part of what I was brought up as a young child. There's this notion in Judaism of tikkun olam, making the world better. And I think we were like that as children, and it was an important fact in going to Iran, important fact as a Peace Corps volunteer, and I was chomping at the bit for Afghanistan. I thought it was going to be an amazingly important adventure, but also an important thing we were doing for Afghanistan. And I just loved Afghan kids. They were great. I just hope Afghanistan will be able to withstand what might happen with the Taliban as part of their new regime. So I am worried about that.
To be continued in a subsequent talk.
George, I wanted to say thank you for everything. And Diana, you've been absolutely wonderful. You both have been just fantastic.
Thank you. It's been great to work with all
And
of you.
Joe, you're always the greatest.